Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, Dr. Mowbray, and thank you for being with us. We appreciate it. So I think this afternoon's session pivots exceptionally well from our last discussion. We were just speaking about the need to redefine the purpose of an organization in a polycrisis world. And now our panelists are going to take on the challenge of considering how we manage culture in the polycrisis environment. So we have a great panel with us this afternoon. You have detailed CVs that have been shared by Kamla. However, I would like to briefly at least introduce each of them. So as you know, Dr. Mowbray is joining us from New Zealand. He is a creative and strategic thinker with broad general management sales and leadership experience. Denis' specialist advisory practice works in the corporate and not-for-profit sectors, covering governance, strategy, and risk. His specialist expertise is behavioral governance, which speaks very specifically to our discussion this afternoon as to how we manage culture and behavior within an organization. His groundbreaking PhD research identified that the joint board and executive operating as a third team is the team that really influences and affects organizational performance. While external factors such as compliance and regulation contribute to performance, his focus is on that third team. It is an identified combination of behavioral characteristics and attributes of the third team, which allows the board to influence the executive who impacts organizational performance. So I'm very keen to hear more from Denis on how this third team has the ability to influence the culture of our organizations. Dr. Dionne Chamberlain Miranda is the managing director and partner in a successful bilingual consulting regional firm known as Chamberlain Consulting Limited, located in Belize, Central America, which operates on a social entrepreneurship basis. In her volunteer capacity, she is a chairman of the Belize Coalition of Service Providers. She holds a PhD in business administration and a master's degree in global management from Phoenix University. She has completed a number of specialized training programs, including leadership at the Center for Applied Sciences in Geneva, Switzerland, one also in Prosky Change Management, and one in DISC Debriefing and Six Sigma. She continues to pursue growth through training and is committed to the growth and development of companies across the world, but specifically in our Caribbean region. She is an expert trainer in market access strategy, utilizing Caribbean Export Services Go Global program, as well as in customer service, teamwork, and leadership. Kamla, has Neil joined us?
No, I'm not seeing him as yet.
Though I'm going to go ahead and introduce Neil briefly in the hope that he'll join us shortly. Neil Parsanlal is an experienced CEO with a demonstrated history of working in the oil and energy industry, as well as both private and public sectors. He is a strong business development professional skilled in HR and IR competencies, nonprofit organizations, corporate social responsibility, business planning, coaching, and government. Neil possesses an MBA from the University of Liverpool with a specialization in leadership development. He holds a first-class honors undergraduate degree in theology from the University of the West Indies, as well as a postgraduate certification in integrated marketing communications. He is also certified in alternative dispute resolution, training trainers, and project management. So I'm hoping that Neil will be able to join us shortly. But regardless, we are going to jump into our discussion. Dr. Mowbray, since you're bright-eyed and bushy-tailed from New Zealand this morning, I'd like to ask you, please, to share your initial thoughts with us on this topic.
Thank you very much, Ronaele. First, it's a pleasure to be here, and really, it's not too early in the morning for me. So, thank you for the opportunity, and welcome to everyone who is on the conference, wherever you happen to be in the world, and to my fellow panelists. So you asked the question how culture influences the performance of the organisation. There have been, over a period of time, many comments made about culture and its impact on and influence on performance of organisations. And you have themes such as, setting the tone from the top, or to use Professor Garrett's excellent book, the fish rots from the head. All of those sorts of things talk about the influence the board has. But often what is not connected is, how does the board connect to the organisation? So the only way really a board, unless of course they take over, the only way a board can influence the organisation is through the executive. So if the executive and board are not collaborating and have three essential strengths within their relationships. So the three essential strengths are synergy. It's synergy about where they're heading, what they're doing, why they exist, their purpose, etc. Trust, and trust is multifaceted. So trust is, I always think of trust as a spider's web, because it's made up of so many disparate parts. It's connected all through the organisation, but it only takes a small mistake to remove trust. And once removed, trust is incredibly difficult to rebuild. And then confidence. And confidence is really important because it speaks to the value and relationships between the individuals and the collective that make up the two teams that operate inside an organisation, that being the board, who operate as a team, often not thought of as a team, but they do, that is how they operate, and the executive. And confidence is knowing that for the executive, they can go to a meeting, they can speak with candour and openness about the issues they're facing, ask questions, and the board can speak to them and help them with their view on the various elements. And similarly, the board can speak openly and with confidence to the executive. And where confidence plays a really important part is that they know when that meeting of the third team, which is the top team in an organisation, the executive may be defined as a top team from an operational perspective. But if you're talking about an organisational perspective, then in my view, the team that has the greatest influence on the outcomes of an organisation is the collective, known as the third team, which is the board and directors. So the confidence element is knowing that when they leave that combined meeting, that one team or a group of people within a team is not going to be derogatory about the other. So, for example, directors leaving a board meeting and discussing quietly between themselves. You've often heard these conversations, I didn't agree with that decision, but I didn't think I could say anything. Or the executive leaving the room and thinking that the board are fools for the type of commentary and analysis they gave. So I always think of, if I think about the directors in specifics, I always think about directors as being interviewers. Because, and if you think of the great interviewers, the Michael Parkinsons, the Walter Cronkites, and others around the world, the things they had in common were preparation, research about the topics that they were thinking of and working on, connecting to the people that they were with. And in the previous panel, someone made a comment about being online. And there is a wide range of research that shows that when we're online all the time, as humans, we do not connect as well. So therefore, it's really important that boards don't get sucked into this idea that we can do everything online, because you don't form that human connection, that human bond. You just don't connect in the same way. And if we did, then relationships around the world would be totally different, obviously. The other thing the other reasons that I think that directors should be viewed as interviewers is good interviewers have an insatiable appetite and curiosity for what they're looking at. And the other really important element is that they don't accept shallow or inane answers from those who are being questioned. And I think an example of that is the issues around OpenAI, which have sort of played out over the last couple of weeks. And there you saw a perfect example of a board whose behavioural governance led it down a path that resulted in lost value, resulted in firing the founder and then the chair resigning, resulted in some say 85 to 90% of the staff signing a letter saying that they'd resign, resulted in a whole range of other issues that came out of their inability to understand the communities of interest that they were working in and what was important to them. The other one is that we think about directors and the issues that they're facing today. And I often think that directors are a bit like a frog in a pot. I don't know whether you've heard this saying before, where you get a frog and you put them into cold water and then you turn the heat up underneath, and they actually don't realize anything is really changing until it starts feeling a bit warmer and they think this is okay, and then it gets a bit warmer and a bit warmer until suddenly they're cooked. And for me, directors are now deluged, and so they're getting to that boiling point. They're deluged with information. A lot of it is false and inaccurate. A lot of it has no relevance. They are more concerned, a lot of them, with their social media presence. They're more concerned about how do I get onto that other big board that I'm looking for, rather than, again, as one of your previous panelists has mentioned, about what value do they add? What's the reason for being on the board other than good lunches and collecting a fee? So, I think it's really important that boards stop and start thinking about their behavioural governance. And behavioural governance looks at the characteristics, attributes of the board and the executive and the collective, and the levels of synergy, trust and confidence that exist there. And until we move away from this compliance-driven tick box board review process, we're never really going to understand the impact that the executive have and how they are influenced, and that is by the board. So the board influences the executive and the executive impact the organisation. Without that connection, then you're going to have two buses heading in different directions. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I think that speaks very clearly to the discussion that we are aiming to have this afternoon. The impact of the board on the executive and the executive on the organization at every level. It speaks not only to determining what the purpose of the organization is, but stemming from that, then what is the culture that is going to help to drive that purpose? So Dionne, could you add your thoughts to that, please?
Okay, well, first of all, I want to say that I've been wanting to jump in like all morning because everybody has said something that has sparked a little bit of interest. So I really want to follow through on what I'm supposed to do rather than going all over the place. But I loved what the professor just said just now, and I'm going to coin that. I love the fact of behavioral governance. I think that's something very interesting in all organizations. And it leads me into my points that I want to make right now, because managing culture in the polycrisis environment and goes back to even Dr. Barrett in terms of where the fish rotting at the head, we have to be very aware that we're having a severe leadership gap in the entire world due to this polycrisis. There are major events occurring, and everyone is cutting training and development budgets. There's a lot of delayed retirement. And then a lot of senior talent is retiring right now. And we're hiring new talent, but there's this new breed of managers who are not necessarily understanding the concept of leadership. And at the end of it all, the leaders create the culture that it is that you're looking at. The Polycrisis, as everyone mentioned today, is leading us into, we're having global healthcare crisis, we're having economic uncertainty, political polarization, socioeconomic racial disparities, environmental impact, and now we're even plagued with wars, things that we've never thought would be happening within our current lifetime. There are many challenges that are being faced right now, and I see this on many of the boards that I'm a part of, and especially within the Belize Coalition of Service Providers. I cannot be upset about their behavior, because the reality is that everyone is struggling to catch up from COVID. Yes, they claim business, but they are busy. People are trying to capture back their economic losses. They're trying to ensure that they pivot so that they don't perish. The world is accelerating at this humongous pace, and they're trying to change and digitize and putting a lot of different things in place so that where they are at what we all consider the world being at a level playing field because of this ability to meet virtually, there is a lot of pressure. However, the gap that I really see, and I'm glad that the previous group spoke about academia, I really believe that universities are not creating leaders. They are still pushing the envelope of managers. And the reality is that we need to work on building that strong leadership pipeline. We need to accelerate the development of emerging leaders within our environments. And so succession plans are key. However, if CEOs and boards are only focusing on driving that financial bottom line, delivering on those KPIs, pressuring and creating burnout and anxiety and psychological instability within the workplace, then we are not going to be ready with having the succession plan and the leaders who will be taking over, or creating that unique culture that is required for us to be victorious. In fact, we are creating a lot of victim mentality, a lot of toxicity within the workplace. We're pushing agendas of colonization, and we have to get over that. We're no longer slaves. And if we continue with a slave mentality and not owning our destiny, we will forever be victims and never becoming victorious within our Central American or Caribbean environments or globally. And we need to adapt to the change and the complexity which is there. So I really believe that leaders, boards, everyone, we have to have a careful and thorough understanding of technology, how to make that company successful, yes, but having that working knowledge of the architecture where we still have that healthy respect for the human component, because you have to add product to the people. And let me tell you, AI can do a lot, but AI cannot deal with toxicity. AI will take data that is put in, and AI is like, what is going on? How do I mean, it can't fix it for us. So remember, the adage of garbage in, garbage out will remain a constant if we don't deal with the negativity and the pain, the hardship, the psychological trauma and drama that exists within our people. And that is what I find on my consulting perspective, is how do we help heal the wounds before we try to drive other areas that are putting more wounds and pain, where people are feeling burnt out, stressed out, feeling on a virtual space. I must tell you, you get more demands. People want you 24 hours a day. They don't really care about your time change differences, you know. Sorry, Kamla, but the reality is that we just want the system and the processes to go on, whether people are tired in bed, whatever it is. And we have to realize that, and I love what Professor just said, is that we need to connect. We are not islands. We need to feel, we need to touch hands, we need to hug. We need to know that we are in a world with interconnected thoughts, minds, and brain. A leader has to accurately predict how future developments will impact the organization. And while we are pushing this driven agenda, how will we clean up the mess? And trust me, when I hear about the climate change, it's the same thing that we're doing now to human capacity. We're damaging that human part. And in 20 years' time, we're going to spend so much time cleaning up the debris and the trauma that exists in our humanness while we're trying to do the earth at this point. So there has to be that careful balance at all times. I'm not asking anybody to go sit on a compost toilet and use corn cobs. We're asking you to have a careful blend and balance with the environment. We're asking, yes, for productivity and KPI delivery, but we need to have crucial discussions with our team members, understanding that we have to deliver and we can't lag behind. But at the same time, mental stability and psychological safety are key aspects that we have to look at. A leader also needs to stem and bring together this multi-generational team. And this requires a variety of talents and skills. And I'm really proud of Kamla to have been able to put this multi-generational team together. Because realistically, we need to learn from all parts. All of us have some value. And I like, I know that many of you didn't get to probably read Professor Barrett's initial writings, but he speaks about the fact that we need to go back to where we are, because this polycrisis is just a circle. It's a vicious circle. This happened in 1920. It's happened in 1940. And trust me, the discussions of a polycrisis will be on for 2070, 2080. Sadly, I won't be here to be on the panel, but some of you might be there, right? Again, technological advances are changing so much, and we have to realize that within this VUCA world, it's volatile, it's uncertain, it's ambiguous, and it's complex, and the speed of change and the speed of impact is hitting all of us. But where there's volatility, uncertainty, complex, and ambiguity, I want you to turn those VUCA acronyms and realize that they're the drivers and the impacts. However, we need, where there's volatility, we need vision. Where there's uncertainty, we need understanding. Where there's complex, we need clarity. Where there's ambiguity, we need agility. So right now we're talking VUCA, but the world is now talking about Bani. And Bani is where our volatility is shifting and we're becoming brittle, where our uncertainty is leading to anxiety and us being anxious. And you know, all of us are now needing coaches and psychologists and all to deal with the anxiety that we're facing. We call it COVID effects. We call it menopause in people my age, but we're anxious. The reality is we're anxious, right? And then there's the complexity. However, nothing is organic. Everything is non-linear. And where we speak about ambiguity, Bani takes us to where ambiguity is incomprehensible, where we really are unaware of what's going on. So we really need to adapt, and we need to eradicate mindsets, cultures, and systems that create high friction and drain organizational energy. And that's within the board environment, within every single environment. I found that I don't want to go to board meetings because they're not a pleasure anymore. I like to volunteer my time for things that give me pleasure. And I can tell you that when you're there, and it's I mean, I must say that leadership has taken on a new title where it's about blame, it's about attacking, it's about really not pulling together for the mandates and why we're there. There's a lot of posturing, there's a lot of ego involved. And honestly, if I'm going to a board meeting and I have to say, do I really want to be with those people today? I mean, that is a question. And I believe that goes right down to what Professor just mentioned, where he talked about behavioral governance, that culture that you want to be there. And so being on a board has its two sides. It has to engage us who are board members, but again, we don't need to wait for board members who aren't engaged or who don't want to be there. I've told everybody, if there's one person in a room, I will engage and give them my all. And if there's two, then I'll do more. Or the same. The reality is that we have to give what we have. So I'm asking, and wrapping up, we need to move from reactive systems and have creative systems. We need to move from scarcity systems to abundant systems. We need to move from legacy systems to future systems. We need to stop leaving a legacy and start living our legacies and creating those cultures that we want to see today, that we want to walk in today. Because I'm really sorry, but I don't need it on my epitaph. I don't need it on my grave spot. I really want to know that I'm living in a culture where people are doing things with intention. Greenwashing is not about intention. Greenwashing is about looking good and not being good. I mean, why walk and clean the beach when I'm never bothered to separate my plastics in my cupboard in the first place? Again, we have gotten so interested, and Covey speaks about this, where we are so interested in who we appear to be rather than who we are. The bling, the cars we drive, the houses we live in, all of these, the posturing has to end. The ego has to end. We need to move from legacy systems to future systems, eliminating that toxicity. We need to build future-proof leadership where it becomes an integral part of the organization's culture, their mindset, their systems, their processes, where it is emanating from strategy to culture, an intentional pursuit, not only to comply because there are rules and regulations and the government put it in place. COVID was a clear part about this. We refused to put on masks unless we were forced. We knew we were dying, but we refused unless it was in law. You know, some people learn to wash their hands during COVID. I was surprised at that, by the way, because my mother taught me to wash my hands when I was little, you know. Again, we need to anticipate the future, create and lead the future. Technology is going to accelerate all of this, but we need to realize that we don't only pivot because we need to move on, but we need to stop pivoting so much so that we do not perish. We need to gain some stability in where we are. Stop shuffling cabinets and shuffling board members and shuffling, because all we're doing then is playing a sophisticated game of chess with the same players on the table. We need to have a difference in mindset, in cultural, in intentional movement for our leadership. And the leader has to lead that. So that is the only way we will have that strategic movement where we have clarity, awareness and action, alignment, engagement and structure, growth, prioritization and value of where it is that we want to go. By combining urgency with agility, capability, and our identity, not human doings, but human beings. Who are we really? Where does our humanness connect? Where are we coming from? And we actually become the leaders we ought to be. And stop focusing on hurry up and pally, but really settling in to being the leaders that we ought to be, creating the legacies that we ought to be living in and want to be a part of for ourselves, for our grandchildren, for future generations. Because realistically, KPIs are really about keeping people involved, keeping people informed, keeping people interested, keeping people inspired. And that is what builds great boards. Boards that come to the table prepared, not just showing up for that money that we talked about, that little stipend and whatever it is, but boards who are prepared to comment, to deliver, to speak about, and prepared to respond to the challenges of their organizations. And that is a reality. And that is what shifting and moving the culture will really bring. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dionne. Well, we all feel your passion. If we weren't passionate before, we're passionate now. I really appreciate your comments, and they pivot very well off of the comments that Denis made earlier, because they focus very specifically on a wide range of issues, yes, but focusing on the role of the board, the role of the executive, and in true leadership. What does leadership have to look like to be able to manage culture in a polycrisis? Leadership, it does not look like management on a page, but instead has to encompass an understanding of humanity, a level of empathy, the ability to connect with each other. And I'd like to go back to Denis and get a bit more of his feedback on those points. How do we use those skill sets as leaders in the boardroom, at the executive level, and to your point, as the third team combined, to drive the type of culture that is necessary in a polycrisis to take an organization forward despite the challenges that we face, despite the anxieties? Can we hear a bit more from you on that, Denis?
Sure. Well, first off, Dionne, great opening. Thank you for that. And agree about the passion. So there's a couple of things really, and one of the most important, and it goes back to this idea of directors being interviewers, is that directors and leadership, so if I use the term leadership as a more open term, need to be able to stop and listen. One of the things that is evident today, and it's evident in discussions and evident in any number of issues that we have around the world, is that you have people who are essentially on two lanes of a highway heading in opposite directions, and neither of them are stopping and listening to the other. So I think the ability to listen first, and listen in a constructive and open way. So not to have a preconceived idea about what it is that you're going to answer even before the person has finished talking. And so you've already got your stereotypical answer ready to go, and you then parrot it because you read it, saw it, or heard it somewhere. I think the other element is that for a lot of boards, and I like some of the commentary that was just spoken about the human connection element, there is too much, or an overemphasis on this influencer influencer culture that seems to be developing across all spheres of our organizations. And it's even creeping into directors and their media profiles, and CEOs and their media profiles. Disney and the recent comings and goings of the Disney board. You know, you had a CEO who left and but didn't want to leave, so stayed on the board, and then as it seems to have been written, undermined the new CEO and then got his old job back again. So, you know, because he thought the other one wasn't doing a good enough job. Well, to be honest, we'll never know, because from the very beginning, the CEO that replaced Iger was undermined by the very person he was replacing on the board. The second element, is that in this polycrisis environment, if I use that term, and the deluge of data and information and requirements, etc., that are being phased upon boards and the team as the third team, there is a clear need for leadership, and I often see boards that act more like a wind vane than a signpost. So a wind vane, as you know, sits on the top of the roof or on the top of a building, and it spins around to whichever direction the wind is blowing. And for a lot of boards, that's how their leadership style is. They swing around to wherever the most wind is coming from. In this case, wind is noise, data, information, however you want to describe it. Rather than being signposts, understanding about where they need to go, clearly articulating that view, and then aligning the whole organization behind that. So I think there's a few things. One is listening. We don't listen well enough as a general rule. We certainly don't listen with empathy. We don't actively listen. We tend to be, I don't know, have you been at functions and board gatherings and those sorts of things where you're talking to someone and you can see they're not actually listening to you? What they're looking for is somebody who's more interesting than you to go and talk to, or the biggest name that walks into the room, and they want to go and have a chat with them. So they're always standing there scanning the room like this, not listening to you and not understanding what you're trying to say. And that happens in boardrooms as well. You see it in board meetings where directors have their phones out. Directors are online, not looking at the papers or information, but online checking their emails or their status or TikTok or whatever it is they might be listening to or watching, instead of paying attention to where they are. So in the third team environment, that's that whole element around synergy. So it's about understanding where you are, what you're doing, why you're there, and committing to that time. And I think directors are incredibly busy being busy rather than busy concentrating on a few things at the one time, which brings me round to the idea of directors being overboarded, sitting on too many boards, and not having the time to commit to the requirements. And unlike 30 or 40 years ago, where the key element of a board's work was what's best for the organization, how do I make the most money, and everything else is almost irrelevant. Today, boards have to think about the environment. They have to think about all the other existential issues that are going on around the world that impact them. And even though people, you know, in my part of the world might say, well, the Ukraine-Russia war doesn't really have an impact on us, it does, because it has an impact across a whole range of elements. So the cost of power is, the cost of gas and petrol, etc., has gone up, direct result of the Russia-Ukraine war. The Israel-Palestinian crisis, that's driving issues around the world. So we have to be connected. We have to listen and understand what's happening in the world. And we just have to stop and occasionally take a breath and go and reassign what is right and think about the issues and work in that environment in the third team, one of having synergy around where we're going, how it's working, trust in each other, listening, and confidence that everybody sitting at the table, while they may not agree totally on everything, has the ability to be candid, question, and present in the moment rather than being somewhere else.
Thank you, Denis. Dionne, you touched earlier on the impact of a lot of different factors having a negative influence on the ability of boards and on organizations to be present, to be empathetic, to understand the level of humanity that we have to make sure to reinforce in our organizations at every level, not to be distracted. There are so many things distracting us. Can you speak a bit more to that, both at the board level and throughout an organization, acknowledging the fact that I think a lot of the things you've touched on have happened because of ineffective governance. So bad or ineffective governance got us to where we are. Good governance has the potential to course correct and get us moving in the right direction. Can you chat a bit more about those points that you raised earlier?
I want to just pivot a little bit off of Professor Mowbray's a little bit in reference to the fact that so many of us are on multiple boards and we're overburdened. The reality is that there is such a leadership gap and deficit, like I mentioned in my first part, or people who want to commit, that this is one of the major issues that we have, especially within the Caribbean, where most boards are voluntary. And if it's a government board, then it's pretty much political appointees who are there just for that stipend. And of course, they come to board meetings, no preparation, no real commitment to the cause or the mandate of that organization. So there are the different boards. Governance, having governance doesn't really solve it. It's really having enforcement and follow through on the governance. Because trust me, every organization that I've ever been on a board has an articles of association, which are duly registered and must follow. However, I've never seen a defunct board member get booted out. In fact, many people use it as a resume filler, which really places well. And what's really sad about this, I think that, again, academia pushes this, because even for our children, as they create their resumes, the teacher will say, well, just go and volunteer for 2 seconds wherever, and then you put that onto your resume, and that's going to help you get into college. So the reality is that we have created this genre of persons who feel that it's all about the CV, it's all about the bling, it's all about how you present yourself rather than who you are and how you are presented. So that is one of the major things. So governance, I don't think that not having governance is not following through on these things are really where our issues lie. And then, of course, the ability of most of our organizations on this small level, the Chamber of Commerce's, the Belize Coalition of Service Providers, all of these agencies which are being run on a very tight financial perspective, we then, it's just like a bad marriage, you settle for the good parts that they have, I mean, it's like, oh, she washes the dishes, so let's keep her, just kidding, right? But we tag on to the little things that people bring, rather than realizing that we should never settle. We can't settle if we really want the outcomes to be overarching and grown. Comes back to Professor Mowbray again, in terms of listening to respond. We're always looking around the room for the person who has the title, the position, the power, the whatever it is. The reality is that I believe that we really need to start in our schools in explaining that inclusion in anything comes at a price. It comes at a sacrifice. Our children in schools right now, they get medals and awards, whether they came to sports day or not, they'll send it home in an envelope the next day. We are starting to learn at a very young age that we don't need to put out to get anything. And this is what boards are doing as well. And so it is very important. And I remember the first speaker from the Chamber of Commerce there said that they carefully choose the skill sets and what it is that they're looking for. And that is really good when you go from that board selection process and having the right persons, the right type of persons, the skill sets, the attitude sets, the mental mindsets that matches the values, the vision, and the vision of your organization. Again, although we want to be able to move forward and have good governance within our organizations, we have to start looking backward and start preparing people for these positions. Because right now, if you notice, I mean, leadership is should never be assigned to the elderly. It should be starting at very young ages, and we have to start doing that. So organizations like ours, we're trying to mentor and coach and bring in persons so that we can grow them, because I want to retire from this. And I'm sure that every board member out there wants to retire, but it's hard to retire when you're leaving it without somebody in the place that can give what you believe that it needs to be getting at that point. So it is absolutely important that we take that step back and we start growing that type of person who can fill the role, but getting rid of those who are just parasites and sucking on to us and causing the organization to be stifled and not grow to where it needs to be. So governance is not the issue. It's enforcement of the governance structures that are in place in the best interest without worrying about hurting people's feelings. We need to make sure that sign on at that first day says, I understand carefully if I am given a scorecard in terms of my board inclusion and I'm not meeting the requirements of why I am here, that I understand that I will be kicked out, just like any good university will do. Just like, you have to stand up to certain levels of review, monitoring and enforcement and delivery. And that is where we're falling short, in my opinion.
So if that is the current situation, and that's in the face of a polycrisis where the situation is only going to become more challenging, more tense, more to be faced by the board and by the organizations that they are the mind and the conscience of, how do we in the short term, because I hear you that we need to groom leaders and not managers, those with empathy, those with foresight, those with all of the skill sets that you've mentioned. How are we going to fill that gap? Because I don't think that the current situation we're in, I tell my kids, I refuse to look at any shows that are stressful, because all I need to do is look at CNN. I don't need anything more dramatic than our reality. Our current reality is boggling to the mind. So how are we going to face that current polycrisis situation, all that is happening around us? How are we going to fill that gap? We don't have the time necessarily to groom leaders to the extent that you're referring to. How are we going to face the current situation with the leaders that we have in place and with the younger generation coming up? How are we going to face the challenge head on as it stands right now?
The way that I personally view it, I believe that it's the concept of that one starfish at a time, converting one person one by one. And I think within this is one of these one starfish. Having Kamala putting together a grouping like this, she's creating a group of disciples, right? We're going to learn from this, and the fact that we took the time to be here means that we should walk away from this not thinking it's a talk shop, but really getting out there and seeing how can we implement this into our environments. I learned a very valuable tool when I attended the Center for Applied Sciences and Negotiation in Geneva, where it was a concept of social and corporate entrepreneurship. And that is why my company today, for every paid job that we do some level of altruism and give back. And so that is how I personally see how I can give back, is where I will speak at environments, I will enter into schools, I will get into where vulnerable communities are for women and girls, work on becoming a corporate company that focuses on not greenwashing, but actually how can I make something different, and aligning myself with that and ensuring that I learn how to listen more and realize that everybody has their opposing objectives. But the only way that we can really make that change is if we create that critical mass, and that groups like this decide that we will walk out of this room today and tomorrow, that we have to implement just one thing that we've heard today. And it's absolutely important for that. And I believe that this is the second time for the past week and a half I've heard the term greenwashing. And I realize that many of our organizations within the Caribbean, we really see public relations as putting out a media release and being videotaped and saying we did whatever it is that we did. We've got to get back to the basics and start doing things with intention, whether it be in our homes. And I like the fact that you said for your children, you said, I don't want to bring in any negativity. That's your first step personally that you've taken to declutter yourself from noise and distortions that can affect you to giving to your children. And that's an amazing one, because you're having two captive audiences right there that you've mentioned that you're shifting. We can't go into the world thinking that we're going to change the world en masse, but we've got to start with our children, with those in our community, with those in our environment. And we have to ensure that our language or verbiage or actions are visible and consistent all the time. And then if it's not, we ask for forgiveness, because I'm not perfect. I will mess up and screw up just as big as anybody else. But I have to say that when I walk away from not being that leader that I want to be, in driving these same things that ought to be in organizations, that I am able to say, you know what, I messed up. I've got to do this better next time. So the reality is that we can't come up with a solution that will, but this grouping of I don't know how many people are in the room is a beginning. Every group that you join, we're creating that critical mass. And at some point in time, we will see and feel the changes. And I've seen it and felt it in not everywhere. So I've got to stop being a fault finder and start being a good finder in my environments. Have emotional intelligence to realize that I need to press that delete button in my brain if too much is coming at me negatively. And like Alistair just mentioned, accountabilities. It's a clear theme that we have to follow through on. As leadership, we have to be ownership, accountability, and responsibility, and not allow blame, excuse, and denial to exist within our trajectory at any moment. But we have to persevere. We have to have grit. We have to have resiliency. And we've got to make the mark today and now. So don't ask who, when, and why. Ask, what am I doing now? And that is how this change will be felt. Small or large.
Alistair has just commented, supporting your point that accountability is fundamental to us making progress in all of these areas. I see Neil has joined us. Neil, welcome. Glad you were able to join us. I don't know how much of the discussion you've heard so far.
Well, I came in when Dr. Dionne was responding.
Okay, well, we'd love to hear your thoughts. I'm sure from the bit that you've heard, you understand that we're having a very passionate discussion on this topic of how we make the choices, make the decisions, take the steps that are going to help drive the right culture at all levels of our organizations, and quite frankly, within our Caribbean territories. Knowing that it's not business as normal, it would have been challenging enough. It was challenging enough facing the leadership issues that we were facing 10 years ago. But right now, in this polycrisis environment, with all that we're facing, is that much more challenging to drive the right cultural behaviors and the right cultures within our organizations and our countries. So I'd love to hear your thoughts, Neil.
Thanks very much, Ronaele. I just came from an organization trying to talk to them about EAPs, about the value of employee assistance programs. And the history of EAPs in Trinidad dates back to when we discovered that people were coming to work drunk. And there was need to do something for an intervention from a management, labor, government, a tripartite perspective. And interestingly enough, the organization I just came from was one of the organizations that figured in the research from 1979. They still have the problem today. So this is 44 years later, the problem still exists. The crisis that they faced then still exists today. And part of that is because we have not, management imposed a solution. But the solution was not from the ground up. There was nothing that said to the mass of the employees that this is something for your own good, for your own benefit, for your own upliftment, for the enhancement of the quality of your own life. So that was not sold to them. So the accountability for the solution was never with the employees. The responsibility began and ended with the management of the organization. So 44 years later, we're still dealing with persons coming to work drunk. 44 years later, with new legislation, the OSH Act, and all of that in place now, we're still dealing with that, and employees still don't believe that they should be part of the solution. Managing in the polycrisis demands that all of us, at whatever level you are in the organization, that we take personal responsibility first and foremost for the solutions. In the particular organization I'm talking about, what we're trying to do now is to help them to see, help the rank and file to see where their responsibility begins and ends, and then cascade upwards rather than cascade downwards. The managing in the polycrisis demands that there be even greater communication from top to bottom. We have not been doing a very good job with respect to communicating with our employees. And we saw this during the pandemic. We were not responding communication-wise. We were not talking, we were not communicating well enough with our employees. So people were left adrift in a number of cases, not knowing what it is we are to do, when it is we are to do it. Managing the polycrisis demands that supervisors themselves now take greater responsibility for managing the KPIs that they give to their departments. Because previously, and we see this in the public service in Trinidad and Tobago, the middle ground of the public service hardly ever holds employees responsible for the delivery on the KPIs. So when we had to send people home during the pandemic, for instance, when people had to work from home, that was a huge challenge because supervisors did not know how to manage during the pandemic, how to set KPIs, how to manage KPIs. And therefore, in the current scenario, what we have is the need, the necessity for all of us to come together and understand where we are in the value chain and to accept our personal responsibility for each part of the chain so that the whole can in fact survive. That's the only way I see us being able to manage that. And the communication aspect is absolutely important. Dr. Dionne spoke of the emotional intelligence. More and more we're seeing where supervisors must, where we have to stop, not stop per se, but we have to encourage recruitment, and recruiters to pay more attention to emotional intelligence. Your technical competence is there. It's on your CV. We can check that very easily. But the emotional intelligence of our leaders is an absolute necessity in these.
Can I ask any of you, the points you just spoke to, emotional intelligence, communication, the specific scenario you were talking about with the employees coming to work drunk or intoxicated years later, there's obviously an underlying issue. Individuals do not choose to become intoxicated to the point of going to work and being incompetent unless there is an issue. There is a fundamental issue that has not necessarily been addressed. Is that part of the discussion in that organization and in others where there may be widespread issues? That emotional intelligence, that empathy, that human connection, those things, the underlying issues will not be addressed if leadership doesn't have those skill sets. Was that part of the discussion, or is it purely about communication and taking ownership at the lower level?
It is part of the discussion because we are now talking about the introduction or the rolling out of an employee assistance program that will be able to deal with, that employees will be able to deal with on a one-to-one basis, on a more personal level, to deal with the issues behind why am I coming to work drunk.
So can I, it's not often you appear on an international panel and we start talking about people arriving at work drunk. I think
welcome to the Caribbean.
I think what Neil's talking about is really interesting because there's a couple of things that I think are important. For that culture to have become the norm, somebody somewhere must have initially given it permission to exist. If the permission wasn't given to exist, then over time, they, as Neil has highlighted, the people who were coming to work intoxicated or after having a few drinks would have been helped in the initial phases. So what, and this is making some assumptions from a very limited amount of data, but what seems to have been occurring is that you have an environment where people see others coming to work after having drinks, and is that I just have to say here, is that any worse than the board and executive having a boozy lunch and going back to work? So going back to the employee thing, employees have seen people coming to work and after having a few drinks, or going out at lunchtime and having a few drinks. So the instant thing is, that's part of the culture. That's what I do. The tone has been set. So if the board has a 3-hour board meeting on a Friday morning, then disappears for the afternoon for a couple of hours, comes back certainly a lot happier than when they left, then the employees are looking at that and going, oh, okay, so that must be okay. And to the communication aspect, I think, which is really, really important. And again, it goes back to that high level development of the third team, and the communication between the board and executive, synergy, trust, and confidence. So have you seen, and your panelists may have seen, those wonderful videos where they have videos of starlings, etc., and they're doing all these flying together, thousands of them together, and they call them murmurations. So when they're all flying together and they seem to change shape, and it's an amazing view. So if you haven't seen it, you want to have a look at it. Murmurations are what they're called. And scientists were trying to work out how could thousands of birds coordinate their flight in such a way that these beautiful patterns appeared, but you didn't end up with chaos. So, thousands of birds all banging into one another and falling out of the sky and so on and so forth. And so what they found, or are suggesting, is that within a murmuration, remember, thousands of birds, they are actually working in small clusters of approximately 7. So the 7 are taking note of, or 1 is taking note of the 7 that are around them. So if you multiply that out, you have clusters of 7, all taking note of what's happening around them. And that's how they're able to coordinate, communicate, and set the direction that they're going to go together without crashing into one another. And I often think in today's world, we try and do too much global communication, too much of, I'm going to reach out to the world, and you can't reach out to the world. Leaders need to slow down and think about the audience they're talking to. And that means that the principle and the key message will be the same, but the delivery method, focus, approach will be completely different depending on the audience that they are talking to. And so I think to coming back to Neil's commentary, and that is that for me, at some point in time, someone gave them permission to do that. And now it's just part of the norm. And again, if it's okay for the board and executive to have a boozy lunch, why isn't it okay for the secretary? And if it's okay for the secretary, why isn't it okay for the office worker? If it's okay for the office worker, why isn't it okay for the person on the floor? So you can't have a culture where one group of people are allowed to do something that they say is not allowed, and the other group of people are being told you're not allowed to do it. So, yeah. Sorry.
And I believe that ties back into the board situation. We don't allow staff members to not come to work prepared. However, we allow board members to come never having read the briefs, having never prepared for what it is that we're going to be speaking about, not reviewing the documents that were delivered the night before or whatever it is. And then they walk in and we're supposed to make discussions and deliberations that is supposedly to lead that organization, that company, that whatever to that next level. So the reality is that I agree with you. However, we also have to realize that the same aspect of governance and enforcement for board participation or board involvement should be there for team involvement, and that plays a role in reference to the procedures, the policies, the standard operating procedures, the articles of association. And it's enforcement, because there's no need to have all of these company manuals and all of these board manuals and governance manuals if we're not going to be looking at them ever again. And that's something that we do. Actually, we do it with the Bible. Imagine that. So the reality is that we love to prepare documents. We love stroke of the pen things. We love to create a new hierarchy and a new document and a new strategic plan and a new everything. But going back to verify, are we delivering on it, is where we are questionable. And so it goes back to what Alistair said again, the accountability. But remember, what is not inspected cannot be expected. So we've got to create the monitoring and evaluation methodology for every type of membership, whether it be as an employee or whatever it is. And in coming up with an employee coming drunk to work, I can tell you that although that might be something that we call it as being Caribbean, that is a mental model that we as leaders accepted, or else it wouldn't happen. I've never had one of those, or maybe I never had a second day, because I wouldn't allow it to happen. So the leader has to lead it. The fish does rot at the head, doesn't it? Right?
Well, I certainly wouldn't want Denis or any of our other international guests to take that seriously. That's not a Caribbean way of living. We're far more professional than that. Neil, that's an interesting case. In my 25 years of practice, I've actually never come across an organization with that being an issue. So that is, it's disturbing, because it to me, it speaks to a far more fundamental issue, a toxic environment, possibly, there are obviously issues there that need to be addressed. So this is by no means a common issue. We said that purely in jest.
I don't want you to think that that's purely in jest, because I must tell you that although it may not be a daily occurrence, we're having to deal with all of the prevailing issues. And it's not just Caribbean. It's a global. I mean, we're dealing with sexual harassment on the workplace. We're dealing with inappropriate fraternization, pilfering, stealing. I mean, so I don't want us to discredit what Neil is saying, because at the end of the day, it is a reality. Worldwide, globally, it's just a matter of, is it being dealt with professionally? On a leadership governance, I think is why Neil maybe brought that up.
Of course, there is issues to be dealt with.
Ronaele, to take off from Dr. Dionne, it's not only what inspected is expected, but what is allowed is repeated.
Mm-hmm.
And once it is allowed,
it was allowed, and it then became.
It is going to be repeated, and that is what we've seen. That's what the research is telling me over the years. This is what has happened.
But what could also have happened and been repeated is if the first or the second or the third case maximum of that behavior of an employee coming to work drunk the first, the second, the third time, or the first, second, or third employee, and a leader taking the time to be empathetic, to invest the time in understanding what the root cause is, how to address it, how to not just have the employee take ownership, but also as a leader take ownership. That could also have become the modus operandi and become the norm.
Of course.
So that others would know that if they faced an issue, they had a leader they could turn to. It would have been a different outcome.
It would. And there's another element, and again, managing in this polycrisis. The organization of which I speak is heavily unionized. Heavily unionized, and I mean militantly so. So that any attempt at interfering, so to speak, with terms and conditions of employment, with disciplining employees, was always met with strong resistance. From the particular unions. In fact, there are 2 unions involved on this particular organization. So that the work of the unions, and what is the involvement of unions, in this polycrisis environment, and how are unions speaking, to their employees in this particular environment, is something that really needs to be explored as well.
So, if I may, there's a point that I think is important. So it comes to the leadership question, and it revolves around again, if we start at the board, and revolves around the chair. So to Dionne's commentary about board members coming unprepared, it is no different than any other situation where if it is obvious when they come to work unprepared, I say work, it's a board meeting, because they ask questions that are answered already in the papers that they have before them. And so in those situations, board members need to be after the second or third time of this occurring need to be taken aside and spoken to by the board chair. So that leadership. And one of the things that we have happening today is that there seems to be a desire for instant gratification. So it doesn't matter what you do, if you don't get 1 million clicks or something like that doesn't happen, then something's wrong. So you have to change the approach. Leadership is a slow burn. You cannot create leaders. Leaders take time to create. And to be fair, even the word creation is a little bit overstating it, because it takes a special type of person to be a leader. Everybody can be a leader, but not everybody can be a great leader. And so what our organizations are often missing are leadership skills of listening, empathy, trust, confidence, all of those things. And they are built by being mentored by people who instill those in you. And so if we have a leadership crisis, the leadership crisis is of our own making. We haven't made the time to develop and mentor our next group of leaders. And so the existential crisis that is often spoken about regarding leadership is of our own making. So if you want to understand why we have this vacancy in leadership, look in the mirror. Well, I can because of my age. Some of you are a lot younger than what I am. But look in the mirror and you'll see the reason why we have this issue. And to the point Neil made about unions and things, and I know it's way off topic, but again, it comes down to a leadership issue. And I have yet to see a job description or a union agreement that has I can come to work intoxicated as part of the agreement. So that doesn't matter where you are in the world. I don't think there's any agreement that has that element in it. So again, I come back to the theme of where I work, and that is around the behaviors, attributes, characteristics of people, the influence they have on organizational performance, and that yes, the tone is set from the top and the fish does rot from the head, but only the impact is only if it's connected to the rest of the organization, and it's connected to the rest of the organization through the executive. And so again, to Neil's point, I think if that's an organization, then I would be looking at the top, not the bottom as well. I'd be looking at both, but I think you need to look at the top as well as the bottom in relation to where is this culture being driven from.
Yeah, and you must agree, the head is rotting, yes, but then the body will slowly rot along with that. And I believe that we all have this complexity when it comes to unionization. However, I think, again, we fell away from the reason why unions were created. Unions were not created to create mediocrity, to create, unions were created when managers or leaders were not listening. And so if a manager is listening and a relationship is being built with that union, a union head and a senior leadership and a board should all be on the same page. And I've seen successful implementation of that within my country. And I've seen destructive relations being built within my country as well. And I think it's a learning situation for all of us to realize that it is indicative that as the leader, we are to build relationships with our union heads, that they should not be feeling that they need to be fighting constantly with leadership and management, because the reality, we're all on the same page. We want the success of the company. We want a shared, harmonious, psychologically safe environment for our team members. And we want profitability because staff want to have continued employment. And countries depend on many of these organized, these unionized companies for growth. It's typically our utilities within the Caribbean region. So the reality is that once we start realizing that it's not competition, it's not unions being stronger than leadership or leadership being stronger than unions, it is really that symbiotic tripartite relationship that the ILO has tried to create. And again, it all requires egos to be removed. But union heads want to play up and show up governments. Governments want to show up and play up that they're in charge. Staff members feel that only when it's combative, my union is fighting for me, and that's when I'm going to pay my union dues. At some point in time, we've got to realize that we're in it for the same reason, and our mandates are to drive us forward. Boards, company heads, and staff and clients, we are all there for the sustained growth of that organization. And until we understand that, then we will understand that governance is key, enforcement is even more responsible, and coaching, mentoring, modeling, and everybody being on that journey together is where we ought to be. But we've gotten so disenfranchised with all of this internal fighting and issues that we are losing sight of that. And that's why we have to step back and realize that criticism is not right. It's critique. We should never be personal in this. We should be intentional in our efforts as leaders. And we've got to step back and realize that we've got to learn how to listen even more and understand. Don't respond just with the intent to reply, but with the intent to understand where the other is going. Realistically, emotional intelligence, like you mentioned, is one of the most key and important things that we ought to work on in our lives. We can't tell people to leave their emotions at the door, but we have to let them know that your emotions are not to be spewed all over everyone. Mm-hmm. And that's what we keep doing with all of this dirty stuff on the news and in the newspapers and all of that. We are in this for the same purpose. And that's where we've got to end. And that is how we can drive that good leadership together, is making people realize we are in this together.
I think that is a superb note on which to close. I would still though like to ask Denis and Neil if they have any further closing thoughts, but Dionne, I think that really effectively sums up.
Before you close, Donnell, my hand has been up for a while.
It has, and my apologies, Nigel. Go ahead.
No worries. I wanted to do two things. Dr. Dionne, you mentioned VUCA, but you also mentioned the response to VUCA, and I'd like you to repeat it or put it in the chat, because I think it was excellent. So while you do that, I will make my comment, which is that for me, culture is driven by the organization's values. And ISO 37000, in addition to purpose, emphasizes values. Values will drive behavior, behavior will drive the culture, but only if as Dr. Mowbray said, the board is communicating with the executive, and the executive then communicates that to the rank and file. For me, if that worker or workers understood their purpose and understood how important their contribution is to the teams that they work with, the issue of drinking on the job should not, or before they come to work, should not arise, or we should have the support mechanisms in place to help that individual deal with the problems that they experience, and hopefully outside of the organization as opposed to in the organization. I just wanted to end with that. So Dionne, Dr. Dionne, please, the VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. What are the antidotes?
In reference to the volatility, we have to look at what the drivers are, the impact are, and the need. So the volatility, we need to have vision. For the uncertainty, we need to have understanding. For the complexity, we have to have more clarity. For the ambiguity, we need to have agility. And I've just sent the actual slide that I'd prepared for that to Kamla, and I'm asking her if she could put it into the chat for me, if that's possible, so that you can look at what the drivers are and the impacts are. And I'm not sure if you're interested as well, but I believe that looking at the converse now, where we're looking at Bani in the future, and not just where VUCA now moves into Bani in the future, might actually be helpful as well. So I will be sending that slide as well to Kamla if she's able to put it up in the chat, because I'm not being able to do that quite well right now. Kamla, do you have that you can work on that for me?
What I would do, because we're actually out of time now, I would have the slide sent via email to everyone. Yeah, is that all right?
Thank you.
That's
Great. Thank you, Kamla.
Thank you.
Yes.
Kamla, can you give us 30 seconds? I'd love to just make sure we wrap up with any closing thoughts from each of the panelists. I think everyone will bear with us for a few seconds.
Yeah.
Is that all right?
I think for me, the question of emotional intelligence, empathy, communication, that ability of the board to fly in its own flight path, as opposed to descending into other flight paths, which only cause confusion. That essence of the board really sticking to strategy and policy, that essence of the board sticking with what the board is intended to do for the organization, but managing their portfolio first and foremost before diving into other flight paths that could only cause plane crashes lower down the organization.
Thank you, Neil. Dennis?
Certainly. Look, it's been an interesting discussion, and we've covered a vast range of topics that, well, you could spend 3 or 4 days talking about the range of topics that we've touched on today. But I think for me, the key thing still relies when I take it back to the governance element, it takes it back to that synergy, trust, and confidence that exists between the board and executive, and how they work as a team, the top team in an organization. And the other thing is that from a governance perspective, I think there are, in essence, 4 roles. So the organization and a governance, from a governance structural point of view, has 4 roles for the board: coaching, supervising, steering, and auditing. And they rely, where you sit in that quad of behaviors, relies on the internal elements. So how strong is the executive? What's their capability like? So on and so forth. What's the external component of it? How important is it? Is it critical? Is it going to cause existential damage? And then is it a long or a short-term element? And that drives board behavior. So over 4 areas. So you've got coaching, steering, auditing, and supervising. And for me, the board, depending on those elements, transitions between those 4 behavioral guidance areas on a regular basis throughout the whole meeting. But at the end of the day, it's about leadership. It takes time for that to grow. It is about synergy, trust, and confidence. And the rest of it is human nature and behaviors. Thank you.
Yeah, and I agree completely with both of them. And we need to just realize that through history and experience, that being passive in times of change will not guarantee success. So although we have to be working on the leadership, it's not about us sitting back and saying, oh, well, we're not going to worry about the rest, because the consumer demands are evolving rapidly, and it's becoming even harder to understand. Technology is continuing to accelerate and creating new opportunities. AI and machine learning are advancing our capabilities. And we need to realize that shifting and pivoting our organizations constantly to try to anticipate these changes doesn't make sense. It takes us 18 months or more to calm down after all of these changes. Let's focus on what is wildly important. And I call that the WIGs. Just write what is the wildly important things. I believe that strategic planning sessions have to cut down with all of these huge documents, have 3 wildly important goals, and focus on those, and then move to them after. We can't be making things too hard for us, because while you're working on figuring out that big grand strategy, the strategy has already changed because life has shifted, the environment has changed, it is no longer relevant. So focus on your WIGs, your wildly important goals, start working on those. Stop changing the hierarchy and the organizational chart and all the plans and all of that over and over. Stop playing checkers and move on to playing chess. And realizing also that the culture will eat that strategy up daily. And we've got to work at all different levels with the coaching, the mentoring, the modeling, the growing, the evaluation, and mentoring, because we cannot continue to pivot every day, or else we shall perish. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So this panel, I think, has exceeded our expectations in our discussion this afternoon. My sincere thanks to all of you, and for all of our participants as well, for all of your feedback, your comments. Kamala, over to you.